Yo, this is Nappy. With the Monument of Triumph release, there's been a rediscovery of one of Destiny's most game-breaking glitches. Which glitch am I talking about? I'm talking about the Universal Canon Glitch, or UCG for short. So, if you're familiar with Destiny's endgame, you might be asking, isn't that a D1 glitch? And the answer is yes, it is, but it's been resurfaced in Destiny 2. We rediscovered ways to get it. And so I'm lucky enough to have been on the front end of testing and figuring out the ins and outs of this glitch. So I'll be sharing a lot of that information with you guys today. So here's what I'm covering in this video. First, we need to answer what is it, where it came from, and what's actually happening. Once we do that, we'll be able to talk about how we can actually control it. That's how we can even get UCG in the first place and even how to get rid of it. And then finally, we'll just talk about some of the use cases that this has. We'll focus less on the broad image and more so specific use cases for UCG. And all of this is super interesting stuff, and you'll probably learn something even if you know a little bit about UCG already. But to answer our first question, we have to go back to the glitch's roots, and that is Wrath of the Machine. So if you're not familiar with the Axis encounter, there are 3 cannons involved, and they're like the Scorch cannons from Grasp of Avarice, but in this encounter there's 3 types, one for each of the light subclasses, so that's Arc, Void, and Solar. And you actually need all 3 of them. The only issue is that when you drop one, you get a debuff that prevents you from picking up a different type of cannon, and it also prevents you from picking up the SIVA bombs that you need to throw at the boss. So this glitch was discovered so that you could solo this encounter, and it might seem unintuitive right now how that works, but let's just take a look at someone who did solo this. Alright, so this is a clip of Axis Bake solo flawless. This is mid-encounter, and he has a Scorch Cannon in his hand. So let's just take a look at what he does. And I want you to notice on the left-hand side of the screen, he has a debuff called Charge Lockout, and it lasts for 30 seconds. This is the debuff that prevents you from picking up other cannons, and also it's the one that prevents you from picking up the SIVA bombs. So you'll notice it's for 30 seconds, and this procs after you drop a Scorch Cannon or any of the other cannons. But let's take a look at what happens. So you'll notice he's picking up and dropping the cannon over and over again. And you might be wondering why that is, but let's take a look at his timer on the left side of the screen. You'll notice it keeps getting reset each time he drops it, but eventually the timer stops resetting. So this was after a couple of minutes of already picking up and dropping the cannon over and over again. But let's rewind so we can see that again. So he picks up the cannon and he drops it and it resets the timer until a certain point. Did you notice that whenever he picked up the cannon again, it stayed at 28 seconds and even went down to 27 seconds. So let's see what happens if we keep continuing. He's going to drop the cannon again, and it doesn't reset his timer at all. It's at 18 seconds. The timer was ticking down the entire time he was in his inventory. All right, so what's actually happening? We saw him picking up and dropping cannons over and over again. Why? Well, in Wrath, if you pick up and drop the cannons over and over again, you will put yourself in UCG. And while in UCG, the game can't give you any buff or debuff, so the timer never got reset after you dropped the cannons. So we know that whenever you get UCG, the game is unable to give you buffs and debuffs, but why? Alright, we're going to quickly detour as I talk about Moth's inventory analogy. We all know that on your character, you can only hold so many items, right? So you can have 10 helmets, 10 arm pieces, 10 chest pieces, 10 legs, and 10 class items, right? You can only hold 10 of each type of weapon too. So at any given point, you can hold up to 30 guns and 50 armor pieces. Imagine you have a full inventory. What happens when you see an engram fall on the ground, right? What happens when you try and walk over it? You don't pick it up. Having a full inventory is a lot like UCG. The only difference is instead of being full on armor and guns, you're full on buffs. When you have full buffs, the game tries to give you any buff or debuff, but it just can't. So I'm going to pull up Paint to show you exactly what I mean. All right, so right here we have a list of your buffs and your debuffs. Okay, this right here, this is a list. All your buffs and debuffs are put on a list. Let's say that you proc Radiant. All right, what happens to Radiant? Well, it gets put in your list and it lasts for a certain amount of time. Say your Radiant lasts 10 seconds, okay? After those 10 seconds pass, you no longer have Radiant. So what happens to this on your list? It gets removed. And the same thing applies for all these other buffs here, okay? If you get Radiant and Devour, it'll get put on your list, but it's only temporary, right? So eventually they're going to get removed from the list at some point. But how does this play into UCG? So your list of buffs in normal playing conditions, right? If you're just playing the game, you're only going to get so many buffs. You know, you can get Radiant, Devour, Amplify. You can get a bunch of different buffs, but you can only get so many. So the developers have seemed to limit the size that the list can be. And we don't know specifically which number this is, but it's around 70. And what I mean by this is if you get Radiant, Devour, Amplified, and then, you know, somehow got, what is that, 67 other buffs, and then you got like, what, Woven Mail too? So right here, you're at 70 buffs, but what happens whenever you get something like an Overshield? You exceed that cap, and the game just does not give you the Overshield. It tries to give it to you, but it just can't. So it just rejects it. So this is what UCG is. UCG is whenever you fill up your list of buffs, so that whenever you try and get another kind of buff, it just doesn't work. And this happens with some armor sets. If you're in UCG and you put on an armor set, you just won't get the bonus. This happens with weapon perks. So a lot of people, whenever the artifacting was going around, people had 7 times pack tactics on their artifact. And eventually, after they reproc pack tactics enough, what would happen is they would lose their eager edge sword. It just would stop working. And I'll show a clip of that right now, what that looks like. But a lot of people were super confused about why that was happening, and it's because the game can't give you the buff that would let you use Eager Edge in the first place. So you might be wondering, why is this beneficial for us? It sounds like it's a bad thing not being able to get buffs. Well, debuffs are also put on this list. So anytime there's a debuff that you don't want, if you're in UCG, you just straight up won't get it. So I'll talk about this later on, but in Gatekeepers, if you go through one of the portals with a relic, you'll get teleport destabilized. This is a debuff. So this gets put on your list of buffs and debuffs. If you're in UCG and you go through a portal with the relic, you just won't get teleport destabilized. And that is super important for a topic later on. But this is essentially what UCG is. It's filling up your list of buffs so that the game can't give you any more buffs. So as I said earlier, that when you lose a buff, it gets removed from the list. So the question is, how are we getting UCG in the first place without having 70 buffs, right? I don't see 70 buffs on my screen. Why isn't my eager working? Or why are my guns gone? This is the key to it all. Some buffs in the game don't get removed from the list when you lose them. Yes, you lose the effects, but after the timer runs out, or it goes off your screen, it's still in the list. It's just not active. We call these kinds of buffs lingering. All right, so let's go back to Paint, all right? We know that we're able to stack up these buffs like normal, like Radiant and Devour, we can get these. But what happens whenever we stack something like Pack Tactics? So Pack Tactics is a buff that, you know, you'll get on the side of your screen, and it's got a timer involved on it, okay? And when that timer runs out, unlike all these other buffs, whenever Pack Tactics gets removed from the list, there's something that lingers behind. We don't know what it is, but something fills up this slot, okay? So if this is like an itemized list and Pack Tactics just filled up the first item on the list and you lose Pack Tactics, the next buff that you get will fill up the second slot, the number 2. It won't be put in the first slot because there's some lingering part of Pack Tactics that's still there. So what we can do is we can clog up the system by continuously reprocking pack tactics. So the next time we reproc pack tactics and it gets removed from the list, it'll leave a lingering trace whatever behind in that list. So what happens if we fill this up to 70? Well, we're in UCG because all of our buff slots are filled. We can't get any more buffs, even though we have no buffs on our screen, right? We lost all the pack tactics. Even though we had to proc it, 70 times? It still filled up the list all the way, and we're in UCG, even though we have no buffs on our screen. So there's like some hidden kind of buff that still persists even whenever you lose these lingering buffs. So what exactly can we use to get into UCG? Well, like I said earlier, UCG is literally just filling up your list of buffs. As long as you have 70 buffs total, whether that's the lingering traces from like lingering buffs, or if it's from just normal buffs that you have on. So we know that certain artifact mods, such as Nobel, Blade Stamina, and Pack Tactics, and also Iron Lord's Vigor, there's a couple artifact mods that seem to linger, and there's also set bonuses that linger. So most notably the 2-piece Streaming City set. You might have seen this on Twitter where there's a person who was in Vesper's host and they were on pace for solo flawless. And then on the final encounter, they pick up the bombs and they're disappearing. And then their Thunderlord disappears. And then the game just stops working. They're not getting radiation. A whole lot of stuff just starts to break. And that's because they were running the 2-piece streaming set bonus. They just continuously reprocced it. So armor mods can also contribute towards UCG, right? So if you have fonts, resist, or surges on, they will be considered buffs on your buff list. And even though they're not lingering, they still contribute towards the amount of total buffs that you have. So if the hard cap for UCG is 70 buffs total, then if you have 9 armor mods on, then you'll be 9 buffs closer to UCG. And this is going to be super valuable because you can take on and off armor mods. Let me show you why this is the key to UCG being powerful. All right, so back to our buff list, you'll notice that we have 68 buffs procced. So all these lingering buffs were procced either from Nobel or Iron Lord's Vigor or from Pack Tactics, but we stacked up 68 lingering buffs. That means we're 2 off of UCG. All right, if we get 2 more buffs, we're at 70, we're in UCG. But we have a bunch of different buffs that we can work with here. Say we want to proc Devour. Well, instead of being at 68 buffs, we're at 69 buffs. And what happens if we proc Amplified? Then we're at 70. We're in UCG. If we try and get Woven Mail or an Overshield, the game's going to reject it. It's not going to let us get that. And the same thing goes for any debuff from a mechanic. It's just not going to give us it's not going to give us that buff or debuff that the game tries to give us because we're in UCG. But you'll notice what's different about Devour and Amplified compared to all these other buffs is that they're temporary. So eventually we'll lose these buffs. So what happens whenever Devour or Amplified runs out? Well, we're back at 68 buffs. We were at 70, so we were in UCG. But now we're at 68 buffs, so we're out of UCG. But remember what I said earlier about armor mods. Armor mods also contribute towards our buff list. So say we have an arc weapon surge and a super font. So these are equipable armor mods. We can take these on and off, and even though they're not active, they still count towards our buff list. So what happens if we equip a super font on our loadout? Well, it gets put onto the list, takes up the 69th slot. And then what happens if we put a surge on? All right, we put it on the list. Oh, we're at 70. We're in UCG. And all we did was put mods on our armor. If we take these mods off, if we swap to a loadout that doesn't have these on, then we're back to 68 buffs. We're out of UCG. So if UCG is a light bulb, then fonts and surges are the light switch. We can easily switch between UCG as long as we're edging it. So what this pretty much allows us to do is control when we are in UCG, which means we're controlling when the game can give us and not give us buffs. So we essentially have a switch that allows us to tell the game whether we want to get buffs and debuffs or not. And that's extremely powerful. So there's a lot of talk about a couple of encounters being potentially solved with UCG, most notably gatekeepers. And there's a bunch of people working on gatekeepers right now. Mainly Moth is trying to get a proof of concept. But the way we can utilize UCG for gatekeepers is by not getting teleport destabilized. So if you're familiar with GK, then every time you go into a portal, there could either be a wyvern or a shielded minotaur. And to kill the shielded minotaur, you have to use the relic. There's a couple nuances to that. You know, last season we had kill shot, which could remove the shields. And then we also had volatile, which was able to remove the shields. But as of right now, there's no way to destroy the shields unless you have the relic. The only issue is that the minotaur is changing which portal it's spawning in, right? So if it spawns on Mars, then the next time it spawns, it's spawning on Venus. And you can't go between those two portals in time without getting teleport destabilized. So whenever you go through the portal with the relic, you'll get teleport destabilized. But what happens whenever we go through the portal with UCG? We don't get teleport destabilized. So now it's possible to just go between the portals and bring the relic to whichever side the shielded minotaur is on, the Praetorian. And you can just farm up your super quick enough to peek into the portal and use your super on him and kill him. And this is the current strategy that's being crafted in GKs right now. We have a couple people attempting it, but it's probably going to get solved before any other encounter. So if you want to check out it being attempted, check out Moth's stream. And then if you want to join like the theory crafting or just kind of see what's being talked about, join the D2 solo raids Discord. There's a lot of resources there and everybody's super friendly and helpful in there. So the next encounter that's probably going to get solved with UCG is Queen's Walk. So as of right now, there is a problem with Queen's Walk, right? You can duo it where you have a second person pick up the heart to start and then drop it. And then the other person who didn't start the encounter can just solo the rest of the way with Lazaku. But the reason why you need an initial person is that whenever you start the encounter by yourself, you're holding the relic and you can't shoot an ad with Lazaku to make the first nest to drop the heart. And that ruins the solo. You can't do the solo because of that initial drop. You can easily solo the rest of the way, but you can't solo the first drop. But whenever you're walking with the relic, the game seems to give you a buff that teleports you inside. What I mean by that is if you have UCG and you're holding the relic, whenever your timer goes down, it just won't teleport you. It'll just straight up just drop the heart on the ground and the encounter continues like that. The only problem is that while you're in UCG, you aren't able to get chosen. So once you drop the heart, you pretty much wipe immediately after because the game doesn't think there's anybody who can get chosen. I'll probably talk a little bit more about solo Queen's Walk in another video. I'm just going over it briefly now, but the last encounter that's being talked about a lot is Taniks. I don't know if it's just cope Sahur, but I don't know if Taniks is getting crafted. I'm gonna keep it a buck. Sometimes whenever you're in UCG and you go to pick up the bombs, it'll just eat it, which soft locks, and it's just not helpful. But it's still being talked about. There's still being attention. And then there's a couple other of encounters that would be beneficial for UCG. Really, any encounter that gives you a buff that you don't want, UCG is going to be extremely helpful because you can use your fonts and surges as an on and off switch for UCG. So you can tell the game exactly when you want and don't want to get buffs. And any encounter that you get a buff that you don't want, you just flip on UCG and you can't get it. So you might be thinking, we have the goose that lays the golden egg at the moment, which it seems true, but the more you look into UCG, the more you'll realize that it has its drawbacks and limitations. With the help of Tachi and a couple other people in the community, we have been putting together a spreadsheet of everything that we have and have not tested for UCG. So if I sort here by whether the buff lingers or not, you'll see that we only have 6 ways to get UCG consistently. So Nobel, the 2-piece set, Iron Lord's Vigor, Pack Tactics, and Blade Stamina, those are all easy ways to get UCG. They linger, so you can just continuously reproc these. The only issue is they all require ads. So you can't self-proc the 2-piece Streaming City set bonus, which means you have to be around ads. This doesn't really affect GK, but this affects Queen's Walk because, unfortunately, since the buff list is around 70-ish buffs, that means you need to reproc all these buffs, or whichever one you're using. You need to reproc it 70 times, which takes a lot of time. The fastest right now is probably Nobel. It's still not super fast. It still takes a couple minutes. And it also requires ads. So that means for encounters like Queen's Walk, you would have to proc UCG or get close to UCG during solo Riven, which is a pain in the backside. It's not practical at all. So right now we're using this sheet to find a way to get UCG without the need of ads, right? That's the $1 million question right now. If you can figure out a lingering buff that doesn't require ads, then a lot of things are going to get crafted. So you don't have to start the encounter to get UCG procced or anything. You can just get UCG or get near UCG before you start the encounter. So the other major drawback of UCG is that it doesn't persist through joining allies and dying. So if you wipe, then you'll have to reproc UCG, or if you just die, you'll have to reproc UCG. If you get joining allies, you'll have to reproc UCG. Everything seems to get reset whenever one of those things happens. I also wanted to briefly mention that not every lingering buff works the exact same way. So there's a couple buffs that are really helpful to get UCG, such as Pack Tactics and Nobel, except they are both used differently. So Pack Tactics will reset every time you change your artifact. So if you have 70 buffs procced with Pack Tactics, then whenever you change your artifact, all those get removed from the list. But the same isn't true for Nobel. Nobel's buffs will persist even whenever you change artifacts. So you can have Nobel on one loadout so you can get close to UCG and then swap to a different artifact and still keep all those buffs. Another buff that kind of stands out is the shooting range hat damage buff that you get. If you don't know, you can turn on hats in the shooting range, and whenever you pick up the blue hats, they'll give you a damage buff on the right side of your screen. And you can keep putting those on indefinitely. However, if you stack enough hats, you will get UCG. So even though it only displays one buff on the side of your screen, each hat that you put on counts as its own buff on the buff list. So you can look at the number of buffs that you have stacked based off the hat damage multiplier. So that's pretty much most of the things you know about the glitch right now. If you want more resources that you can learn more, I recommend the D2 Solo Raid server. It's discord.gg/D2 Solo Raids, and there's a UCG crafting channel. You might have to manually toggle the channel, but it's there, and there's a lot of discussion in it. If you get UCG on accident just by playing, please go to the UCG crafting channel and send a screenshot of just whatever you can get. If you can get a clip, just any sort of information is extremely helpful and valuable to us. So I would appreciate if y'all did that. I'll link the UCG testing sheet down below so you can go check that out. It's free to view. So I'm also going to link a couple of videos by Tachi and Moth down below, so you can go check those out too, where they talk about UCG also. But anyways, that's pretty much it for today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. I'll be as quick as I can to answer them, and I'll try my best to answer them also. I don't have the answer to every question. There's still a couple of unanswered questions, but we're actively working on answering them. So I hope you guys enjoyed. See y'all in the next one.